Great, thank you very much. I don't trust this microphone unless I talk like this, but I'll just try and talk loudly. Good, thank you. It's very nice to have the invitation to come here and to speak about this. The talk will begin with some older work of mine and end with some newer work that's sort of incomplete, but I hope it will be interesting. The subject of this talk is clogging, basically. Clogging, how do things clog in channels and pipes? And the picture here is obviously not a particular suspension in a pipe. This is a traffic jam, but as we will see via a little digression in the middle of the talk, there's a lot of links to traffic flow models in what I'm going to end up talking about. A lot of the work, or the second half of the work, is the subject of a PhD. Anushka's just writing up her PhD at the moment. She's actually at UCL, where I was when she started, and I've subsequently moved to Cambridge. She's working with me and Philip Pearce at UCL. And then there's a little bit, just at the end, I'll mention some of the work of Cara, who's a postdoc at UCL. Okay, so I'm going to get on to talking about clogging of dense suspensions. Suspensions of particles are in all sorts of sectors of everything. They occur all over the place. Here's a list of some: food industry, any kind of industry really, lots of energy applications of transport of particles, where you either do or don't want to clog, depending on what you're trying to do. Biology, there's a particular motivation in biology, which was actually the motivation for Anushka's PhD in the first place, which is sickle cell disease. So this is maybe on a different scale to some other kind of engineering applications of clogging. But sickle cell disease is a nice, it's not at all nice as a thing, but it's a nice applied maths problem. It's actually very poorly, the mechanics of how it works are actually quite poorly understood. Basically what happens in sickle cell disease is that you have red blood cells that when they deoxygenate, which of course every red blood cell carries oxygen around the body and loses its oxygen, that's the point. When it becomes deoxygenated, it becomes unnaturally stiff, much stiffer than it's supposed to, or more rigid than it's supposed to. And that, actually, because of the mechanics of the cell, is what leads to the cell developing this characteristic sickle shape, which is the sort of thing you associate with sickle cell disease. And it's usually at that point said that, oh, they become more rigid and they just clog up, they block, they call it occlusions in your blood cells. So you get pictures like these two pictures here, which is just completely schematic. These are red blood cells at some junction. The idea is, oh, look, these ones have all become sickled. That means they become more rigid, and they're just stopping, they're just clogging the channel. Similarly here, they just become rigid and clogged. And quite why that happens, not why they become rigid, but why a more rigid particle, or a more sickle-shaped particle, would cause the red blood cell to clog, and the blood vessel to clog, and under what conditions that should happen, that's really not very well understood. So that's a sort of background question. And then there are applications in geophysics, which perhaps I'm sort of more interested in, but are not really directly motivating what I'm talking about. I'm just going to show one picture, a slide of pictures, because this is quite interesting. So there's a whole load of nice geophysical examples of clogging. These are the pictures of mostly ice jams, which I think is a really interesting phenomenon. It happens a lot in North America. Here you can see basically what's happened is that this is a frozen ice has formed on a river, and it's ice that it's not formed on a quiescent river. It's formed and there's turbulent motion in the river, so you end up with essentially what's called frazzle ice in the ocean. It's usually called frazzle ice, and it's like little pancakes of ice that form. So it's like a whole load of ice, sort of macroscopic ice particles on the river, and they hit some sort of barrier like the piers of a bridge, and they sort of jam up into each other and cause this obstruction on the river. So instead of just passing through, even though an individual piece of ice could quite happily pass underneath this bridge, that because of this sort of relatively small obstruction in the river, they can cause significant obstruction. Here's a sort of top shot of the same thing. And this is actually quite problematic when this thing melts, because you end up with this massive load of water that's deposited in a certain location rather than being more spread out. Here's a very old picture of a steam train going across a rather dodgy-looking bridge, honestly, with an ice jam behind it. And there are other kinds of particular suspensions. Here's a lovely old picture, I guess, from the 19th century of after a storm. Essentially, there's loads of debris, mostly planks of wood, tree trunks and such like, in the Charles River in Prague, and they've done the same thing. They've jammed up at the piers of this bridge. Right. This is really the sort of a lot of studies of this phenomenon look at individual particles and how they interact with each other, which is a very sensible place to start. But there's a question of can one use continuum models of dense suspensions to predict and understand some of the mechanisms of clogging? And that's basically what I'm going to talk about today. So, suspensions, if you've come across in a professional capacity working with suspensions, you will know that they have a very complicated rheology. And actually the continuum models of dense suspensions are basically still quite incomplete in terms of capturing everything that's going on. Nevertheless, there are certain sort of generic things that one can say about suspensions. This is a whole load of accumulated rheological data of suspension showing the effective shear viscosity as a function of the particle fraction, so the volume fraction of particles in suspension. And basically, if you scale by some critical value, you find that these things, the viscosity essentially diverges as it approaches this value. So this is jamming. This is the thing becoming unable to deform as you exceed some critical volume fraction of particles. So that's, I mean, this is sort of the most basic statement is that the rheology of the suspension depends on how many particles there are, and that this particle fraction can cause the thing to jam. And actually, this middle point is something I'm going to come back to, that in a dynamic situation like flowing down a pipe where things might be changing, the particle fraction can also evolve in response to fluid flow through the suspension. This last point, that the thing can jam, implies the concept of something called a yield stress. And that's where I'm going to start by basically saying what do we need to know about yield stresses to help inform this question. So that's where I'm going to, this is an outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start off just looking at what I would call simple yield stress fluids and move on to suspensions later on. The concept of a simple yield stress fluid is something I've spent a lot of time working in over the last 10 years or so I'm just going to tell you a little bit about that to set the scene, and then we'll move on. So, by a yield stress fluid, I mean, this is really something that's substantially simpler than a suspension, but it is an important constituent part. I mean something like this, something where if you measure the strain rate that you observe when you apply a particular stress to the fluid, or vice versa, you find that there's some finite offset from at zero strain rate. So at zero strain rate, there's a whole load of stresses below some critical value where nothing happens, essentially. This is an idealization, but this gets the idea across. So the Newtonian fluid would have a linear relationship between the stress and the strain rate, with the slope being the viscosity. The yield stress or viscoplastic fluid would have an offset. This may or may not be a straight line, there may or may not be elastic effects going on as well, but the key thing I want to focus on here is that there is this offset with a yield stress. And there's all sorts of materials in life that exhibit, yield stress-like behaviour, so there are all sorts of things in the household. Ketchup here, you see this pimple on the top of the ketchup bowl, that's held in place because the gravitational stress that's on that is not enough to exceed the yield stress, and so it just locks it in. The toothpaste too, right? It doesn't just, if this was honey, it would just spread out over the table at this point, but it doesn't do that because it's got a yield stress. Mud is actually a dense suspension, so it's more complicated, but it again has the tire track leaves a mark, right? Your footprint leaves a mark in certain types of mud because it doesn't flow back in to fill the space. And the absolute simplest model for a yield stress fluid is something called the Bingham model, which in tensorial form looks like this. So this is just a mathematical way of representing this box at the top. So here I have, if it was 1D, then this would just be a scalar. The stress is, this would cancel with this, right, in magnitude, so you have this offset plus the normal viscous bit. So this plastic term, and then there's this viscous bit here. And that's the key idea for these viscoplastic fluids. Right, and I'm going to get on to talk about flow down pipes of suspensions. An important idea comes from just thinking about flow down a pipe of a yield stress fluid. This is sort of everyone's undergraduate course in fluid mechanics. You look at pipe flow, Poiseuille flow. In steady state, there's a balance between the pressure gradient pushing the stuff down the pipe and the shear stress gradients across the pipe. So this is a channel here, not a pipe, but this could equally be a pipe. This you can just integrate up to tell you, and then by symmetry you see that the stress has to go through zero at the origin. So you expect from this kind of, for a fixed pressure gradient, you expect by integrating this up that the shear stress tau is linear across the channel, like this, and by symmetry it must go through zero at the center. Now that means if you have a yield stress, if the material has a yield stress, there is some region around the center where this stress is below the yield stress because it goes through zero at the center. So an inevitable feature of yield stress fluids in pipes or channels or slots or anything like that is that the center line has this kind of flat plug-like region. There's some central region where the stress is below the yield stress. It can't deform, so it must be a plug like that. So this kind of velocity profile is very characteristic. This is not strictly relevant to what I'm going to talk about, but I thought I'd just extend that idea a little bit to talk about what happens if you put these kinds of materials not just in pipes, but in sort of genuine extended slots, something called the Healy-Shaw cell. Many of you will have come across the idea of a Healy-Shaw cell. This is Mr. Healy-Shaw, state-of-the-art mobile. This is very beginning of the 20th century. And this is was actually developed as a way to visualize potential flow. So this was, and it's used, many of you will have seen this album of Fluid Motion. It's a very famous collection of beautiful pictures of fluid mechanics phenomena. And Van Dyke uses Healy-Shaw cells to visualize potential flows. This would be like potential flow, inviscid flow around a disk, for example. In fact, the Healy-Shaw cell physics are exactly the opposite of potential flow. They're completely controlled by viscous drag, not by, but it's a sort of quirk of the problem that you end up solving the same problem as you do for an inviscid flow. The pressure field is not quite the same in the two cases, but there's this analogy. Anyway, the point is, for a Newtonian fluid, this thing becomes a nice, straightforward Poisson problem. If you have a Bingham fluid, so you're expecting this kind of profile, the general problem of flow in a Healy-Shaw cell, for example, flow around an obstacle like this, becomes a little bit more complicated because of this nonlinear rheology. So the way that the kind of classic approach you do here is you derive your flow profile like this across the slot, and then you integrate over the slot to develop a relationship between the flux, that's the sort of vertically integrated, so this would be now a function of x and y, but not z, you've integrated out z. So the flux down the slot, which is just the integral over the z direction, as a function of the pressure gradient in the x and y direction. So that's this kind of relationship here. So if you do that for a Newtonian fluid, you get that the flux is proportional to the pressure gradient. So here I'm letting Q be the magnitude of the flux and S be the magnitude of the pressure gradient. For a Bingham fluid, or in any non-Newtonian fluid, this whole thing becomes much more unpleasant. And for a Bingham fluid, you get this sort of non-linear relationship, which you can plot, and it looks like this. So it looks a bit like the plot I showed before of the actual rheology. It kind of makes sense that what you now have is that there is some critical pressure gradient below which you can't force anything through the slot. In other words, this purple region grows to fill the entire slot, and the thing just stops moving if the pressure gradient is too low. So you try and push stuff and nothing happens until you exceed some threshold, and then it goes. So you can play around with this. This really is a digression. This is called a slight digression, but it is a significant digression from where I'm going. But it's kind of interesting, so I'll just mention it briefly. You can, for example, look at what does flow around an obstacle in the Healy-Shaw cell actually look like for these yield stress fluids. This is the Newtonian problem, which I showed on the previous slide, an actual experimental picture. And if you start putting a yield stress in, you get things like this, where the grey region that I'm showing here is a region where the purple bit here has filled the channel, so the stuff is not moving. It's like a stagnant, clogged region, if you like. So essentially what happens, if you think about this, there's a stagnation point at the front and back of this disc as the fluid comes in, hits the disc, and goes around it. This is like a top-down image. You should imagine having a slot on your table. You're looking at it from above. This is the color scale here shows the flux, so it's everything's depth average, depth integrated. And here you're finding that this central plug, which actually exists everywhere, so even far away from this region, there is a central plug of unyielded stuff, but in this grey region, it's filled the channel and stuff is stagnant and locked there. There are some interesting, so I'm not going to show you any experiments of this, but we have actually done some experiments, and you can get some qualitative agreement. The key thing you find as soon as you do any experiment with yield stress fluids is that you lose this front-back symmetry that is sort of hard baked into the mathematical model. And there are various possibilities for that. One of them is that actually any real viscoplastic fluid will have some degree of elasticity. As soon as you have elasticity, you get different things going on at the front and back. That's well known for spheres in isolated, in fact, Oliver he's worked on that problem. But you get the similar sort of thing here. Anyway, there's even bigger digression. If you're interested in these slot flows, it's kind of an interesting point that they are quite different from what you might call two-dimensional it's just a two-dimensional fluid mechanics problem. So you imagine there's no boundaries, you're just doing a 2D problem of flow around, for example, a disk or a cylinder. In that case, you get this. So this is, I guess my point here is to highlight that the physics of this problem, although you sort of, the way I'm presenting it, you've integrated out the boundaries by integrating across. Everything is completely controlled by the fact that it's viscous shear on the walls that's controlling the flow profile. And that's what gives you this sort of profile. If you don't have that, if you just have like 2D Stokes flow, effectively, you get this sort of problem instead. This is flow around a disk in an unbounded domain. You get the flow. It looks like this rather beautiful structure. This is the velocity field. This is the strain rate. There's all sorts of interesting geometric features associated with plasticity in this problem, which are not here in this slot problem. So that's, I guess, there's a lot more I can say about that, and I don't want to distract too much. But the point there is to say the slot problem, when you present these depth integrated things, it's easy to forget that everything is really being controlled by the top and bottom walls, that the shear on the wall is controlling everything. Right, just to continue this vein, you can sort of have fun with this. Once you've set up this problem, you can think about, for example, what if instead of being an obstacle in this channel, you have a sort of a change in the width of the channel. So you have a slot, let's say 2 glass plates, where there's a little bit where they just become slightly closer together or slightly further apart. Then, of course, the resistance is different in that bit, which will change things. So here I'm just showing a quarter of the domain, but everything's symmetric. You can imagine flow around a contraction that is not a full obstacle, and you get deflection because the fluid would rather not go through the contraction, but some does go through. But if you increase the yield stress or push slower, you find actually some of the contraction just clogs up completely, and at that point you end up with something that looks a bit like an obstacle, because it just becomes so difficult to flow through that contraction that it just jams it up. The same thing with an expansion, it kind of sucks the fluid into it, and actually if you have a high enough yield stress, it sucks it in so much that it clogs up the stuff on the side of it, so you get this sort of hat that extends quite a long distance above it's focusing all the flow into it. And you can then have fun saying, let's have an array of contractions, and you get this sort of behaviour. Or if you have a high enough yield stress, you get this kind of channelization as fluid tries to find its way through this map of where there are contractions or indeed expansions. The fluid tries to find the easiest path through the series of expansions and leaves a lot of the material clogged up. So you can get this really quite significant localization and sort of local jamming and deflection, all associated with having a yield stress in a slot. Right, that was my digression into slots and such like with yield stress fluids. The key ideas of you can get jamming, you get deflection and such like will become relevant for suspensions, but there are a few more things we have to think about with suspensions that make the thing a bit more complicated. So I'm going back now to think about suspensions rather than yield stress fluids per se, and I'm going to try and focus on some of the key ideas that people have observed with particle suspensions. So we've already seen this plot. There is this yield stress-like behaviour when the particle fraction hits some critical value. That's, I guess, my third point here. Particulate which is jammed at a critical particle fraction. I mentioned earlier this idea that the fluid can move differentially through the particles, so you can get, at some level, the particles are like a porous medium that is able to move. You can push fluid through that. It doesn't have to drag the particles with it. So you can get this differential motion of fluid and particles, which is an important point. There are two phases. I guess that's even the more basic statement, is that there's a particle phase and a fluid phase, and they don't have to do the same thing, although they're clearly coupled in some way. And there's an idea of what's usually called particle pressure, which is an important concept when you're thinking about suspensions. And I'm going to try and demonstrate that here. So if you know anything about the literature of suspensions, people get very agitated about this idea of doing what's called volume control testing or pressure controls testing on dense suspensions. And basically what they mean, mathematically they all boil down to the same thing, but the idea is as follows. You could imagine having let's say a rheometer that's got some fixed plate, so you put stuff in between two plates, and you're able to impose stresses and pressures on the plates. So this is what's called a volume control situation. You say, I'm going to control the volume of fluid that I've got, and I'm not going to let it change, volume of material. And let's say you apply a shear to the top plate, you could also measure what the normal stress is on the top plate, and that you would find, depending on how confined you'd made it, you might measure some normal stress response associated with the fact that these particles can push into each other and sort of create a normal stress, create what's called a particle pressure. Or you can do the opposite sort of test where you say there's a porous plate at the top upon which I exert a fixed load. Like you put a fixed weight on this thing and you say this is, or you control exactly what the load is on this porous plate. And then you allow it, but you allow it to be on some sort of platform that can raise or fall. So as you shear it, you find that this will naturally rise up or drop down as the particles under shear, they start banging into each other and, let's say, pushing apart, and they'll push this plate away. So in this left-hand case, you're essentially controlling phi, this particle fraction, that's the volume is controlled, and you don't know what the pressure you're going to measure is. On the right-hand case, you're essentially imposing the pressure, and you don't know what the phi is. You measure what the corresponding sort of change in volume of this thing is. The two things, the way you present a model for these two things is somewhat different, but they actually boil down to the same thing. So if it's volume controlled, what you find, I guess empirically or by a dimensional analysis, is that the shear stress is related to the strain rate via a viscosity, which depends on the solid fraction. And the particle pressure is also related to the strain rate via a viscosity, an effective viscosity, which is a different function, which depends on the particle pressure. And that's what this measurement is. That eta s, this shear viscosity, is what this is trying to be measured here. So that's the kind of, if you're more used to sort of standard fluid mechanics, this would be a framework that I think most people would sort of buy. Stress is related to strain rate with a viscosity. If you're doing this pressure control thing, this is the world of the famous mu of I model. If you've ever come across anything in granular media, you will probably have heard of mu of I, which is often used sort of as a buzzword. And there's an equivalent here in suspensions, and what they mean by that is that actually in this pressure controlled world, you find that the shear stress is related to the particle pressure with some constant of proportionality, which is not a constant at all, but it's this thing mu of j, which depends on this combination of parameters j down here. So in other words, what they're saying, if j was not there, if this was just tau is mu, some constant times p, this would be like Coulomb friction. This would be a frictional relationship. Stress is related to normal, shear stress is related to normal stress. That's exactly the relationship of me dragging my hand on the table. The harder I push down, the harder it is to push sideways. That's classic Coulomb friction. And that sort of makes sense that if you've got lots of rigid particles bumping into each other, there should be some frictional response. So that's kind of where this framework comes from, but then it's empirically observed that the friction factor, mu, is not a constant. It depends on the shear rate and on the particle pressure, in fact, in this combination here. And in this world, you also have phi as some function of j as well. So these two seem like quite different ways of posing the rheology of this suspension, but actually they're completely equivalent depending on the choice of these functions. So again, it's easy to get a bit lost in the detail here, so I'll try and focus on the important bits. What people have found empirically is that you can measure these things. You can measure eta, the two etas, or you can measure the mu and the phi, and you get some fits. The key detail, I think, to take away from the mu of j is that when j goes to 0, j is really a glorified gamma dot. J is, you think of it as a glorified strain rate. So when the strain rate is 0, and it's not deforming, mu goes to some constant mu1. So then it becomes like a Coulomb solid, it just becomes frictional. And then as you increase the strain rate, you increase this friction factor mu. The precise way in which you increase it is there's some details, but that's, I think, the important thing. Phi of j, also you have this thing where as you increase j, you drop, phi drops. That's dilation, effectively. If you shear a suspension, the particles bump into each other and try and move apart from each other. So that's kind of what's going on there. These are actually kind of equivalent ways of representing the same thing, so I'm not going to, I think, dwell on that. Except that here you can see explicitly, it turns out that if you unpack this and repack it in this language, you find explicitly that there's a shear viscosity, which as phi approaches some critical value, which we call phi m, it blows up quadratically, in fact, and actually the normal velocity, their viscosity does as well. And that was what those measurements were on the previous page. This is essentially this quadratic blow up. Right, okay, panic not, this is quite difficult to follow. The key detail here is that you can unpack all of this into something that looks much more like a normal, generalized non-Newtonian fluid, where you say that this, I don't like all this dependence on phi, it's confusing me, I can just eliminate phi from the problem and relate tau to gamma dot in a sort of traditional way. And if you do that, you find that there's some corrections associated with this bit in the square brackets, but they're not too important phenomenologically. The key thing that drops out of that is you get an expression that looks like this. And you may or may not recall that this looks very similar to the Bingham fluid model that I presented several slides ago. Crucially, if you ignore this first term, this is just tau is eta times gamma dot. Eta is my viscosity, my constant fluid viscosity here, so that would just be a Newtonian fluid. The first term is like a yield stress. It's mu1 ps over gamma dot times gamma dot. So that's like a yield stress, and in fact you find explicitly that this only holds if the stress is bigger than this value. Otherwise you get gamma naught is 0, and phi is this phi m value. So in other words, you can repose this thing as a type of yield stress fluid with a yield stress, crucially, that is not a constant. It depends on the particle pressure. Sorry, I think I've unhelpfully changed. PP and PS are the same thing. So one stands for particle and one stands for solid, but they're identical. So anyway, so a PS or a PP, they're the same thing. So this particle pressure essentially comes into the yield stress. So that is, I think, probably the most important thing about a suspension rheology, is that it's, or indeed any granular rheology, it's like a yield stress fluid, but the strength of the yield stress depends on how strong the confining normal stress is. So if you stand on it, it's harder. It's got a higher yield stress because it's under more normal stress. Right. So that's the important point to take away from all of that. Okay. So now, if you're trying to think about flow along a pipe, for example, you take this rheological model, you plug it into a sort of pipe flow model, and see what happens. The key thing is you have this particle fraction phi. We're going to have a particle velocity and a fluid velocity, and the suspension we can think of as being made of you can either think of it as being made of particles and fluid, which is a very sensible way to think of it, or you can separate it into what you might call the suspension phase, which is the particles with the fluid that's moving at the same speed as the particles, and the rest of the fluid, which is traveling at some differential speed relative to that. So if you think about this, right, the whole kind of wet mixture will be flowing along at some speed, but there may also be, on top of that, some differential motion of the fluid, which goes slightly faster or slightly slower than the particles. So that's the way I'm going to kind of think about segregating it. And the reason to do that sort of segregation, is that this bulk suspension is what satisfies this rheology I've just been talking about. So you can put that into the model directly. So okay, the key ingredients you need to put in here are some equation that conserves mass of particles. So this is just conservation of particle mass. This is just a statement that there is a total flux down the pipe. So I'm going to think about a pipe in the z direction. This is just saying the total flux is made of the solid and the fluid, effectively. And then there's this standard pipe momentum balance, right? This is just this is the pressure grade, total pressure gradient, which I'm going to call G, capital G, balancing cross pipe gradients in the sort of suspension shear stress, which is this bulk suspension bit, and that's where this rheology that I've just been talking about goes into that tau. And then on top of the final thing is you need some description of how fluid can seep through the suspension phase, and that would be Darcy's law. This is the Darcy, the seepage velocity, the relative velocity of fluid to solid, which I'm going to call UD, is proportional to the pressure gradients with some permeability. So this is sort of standard porous media problem. Okay, with that you can then integrate up, just like you would in a sort of undergraduate fluids problem, or flow down a pipe. You don't get Poiseuille flow because it's like a yield stress fluid. You get something that looks much more like a yield stress fluid. So here I'm showing the particle velocity, but equivalent, this could be the whole suspension velocity, and you see that you get this sort of central plug region and then shear layers on either side. And as you change, and the whole thing is kind of controlled by this parameter grouping here, which is G is the driving pressure gradient down the pipe. Remember, this mu1 PS is actually my yield stress, although it's also the particle pressure. So this is really a balance, a ratio of how strong the forces that you're pushing the thing down the pipe are to the yield stress, which is constant. When this thing is less than 1, or equivalently when this thing is, mu1 is just some rheological parameter. So when this happens, the whole thing jams up. This flat region will grow to fill the entire channel, and this is the solid fraction. You'll find the central plug-like region will just fill the entire channel. So it's just like a yield stress fluid. If you drop below the yield stress, the whole thing jams up. Phi goes to its maximum value, nothing happens. From the point of view of understanding how you might get clogging, you want to integrate this a bit like I did with the Healy-Shaw cell. You want to vertically average, or not vertically, radially average this thing to get a kind of bulk equation for the average solid fraction down the pipe. So that's what I'm going to do. And in so doing, that mass conservation equation boils down to something like this. It just says d by dt of the average solid fraction plus the gradients in the average solid fraction flux are 0. So this, in fact, all the rheology and the interesting stuff goes into what is the functional form of this combination here. That's basically what it boils down to. And I've just written out here, there's this statement of, imagine we're imposing a fixed total flux, then this Q would be some constant, and that would be made up of the average solid flux, or the average suspension flux and the average Darcy flux combined. a way that could be helpful, you don't have to think about it this way, but if you like a way of, this expression for the flux can actually be kind of a helpful way of getting your head around what we're going to see happening. You can actually think of this thing, if you define in kind of engineering terms, an overall resistance for this problem, the ratio of the pressure gradient you're applying to the flux that you get out the other end. You can define a resistance like that. You find from this second expression that that you can relate the total resistance of the problem to the effective resistance of the suspension and the effective resistance of the Darcy phase, averaged in this manner. And that is exactly what would happen if you're more familiar with something like electrostatics, where you think about resistors in parallel. Effectively, this system is like a suspension and a Darcy phase. This is like the porous medium bit, and this is like the bulk suspension bit in parallel. And RO here means R, the overall resistance. And you find that you can do this. You can actually just work out what these things are, and you find that as the solid fraction increases, for a particular choice of permeability, you find the resistance to Darcy flow through the thing is much higher than the resistance, that's the red one, is much higher than the resistance of the suspension to move, the blue one, until you get very, very close to this jamming fraction, when suddenly the suspension becomes almost impossible to move. In fact, it does become impossible to move when you hit this jamming, at which point it changes and pushes all the material through the porous medium instead. So it's like when it jams up, it'll just push all the fluid through the porous medium instead. So although the red line resistance increases, it's much less than the blue one in this limit, and so the overall resistance is predominantly controlled by the blue one until you get right close to this jamming fraction, when the Darcy resistance takes over. Right, okay. Now we're going to hopefully get to the interesting bit. So you've got this equation for flow down a pipe. It all hinges on what this thing in here is. Imagine you do some sort of pipe that's got a constriction in it, let's just say. Some pipe here that we're going to say the radius becomes smaller as you go down it. And let's say I'm fixing the total flux. So I'm going to fix the total flux of this stuff down here, and I'm going to see what happens. Everything is controlled by this grouping here, R squared phi US bar, which is the average flux of solid, which I'm just going to call capital F. And I haven't gone through the details of how you get that, other than that you integrate the equations I was talking about and it drops out. But you can plot what it looks like, and you get something that looks like this. So here, there's too much on this plot, so I apologize, but don't panic too much about the different lines. They're just for different permeabilities, which I'm characterizing by something called the Darcy number. You can essentially ignore the yellow one. Think about, and the red one in fact, just think about this blue line. What I'm showing you here is the solid flux down the pipe. This is just at this point, just a pipe with a fixed radius. So I'm going to come to this problem in a minute, but suppose I've just got a fixed radius. I'm plotting the solid flux down the relative amount of flux that is made of solid, which is F over the total Q, as a function of the solid fraction. Here normalized so that 1 is this critical solid fraction. And what happens is, as you have a higher solid fraction, you get a higher solid flux, and the blue line increases, until you hit some point quite close to this maximum solid fraction, at which point the whole thing comes plummeting down again, because at that point, crucially, I'm assuming no slip on the walls here, which is a subtlety which could be important. As you hit this jamming fraction, the whole thing just stops moving because it's jammed up, and you just get Darcy flow through the whole thing. So there's like this boundary layer here against the edge where the flux comes plummeting down again. This fact that the flux basically has an interior maximum and then comes down, so in other words, for a fixed flux, there are two possible values of phi you could pick, right, that give you the same flux. That feature will be important for understanding what happens in these channels with constrictions. This is drawn here with a fixed total flow rate. You can do the same problem with a fixed total pressure, and you get exactly the same phenomenon with an interior maximum. Right, my last digression, which is important, is that this actually boils down to a kind of classic problem in hyperbolic applied mathematics of traffic flow. Because basically what you're doing here is solving what is a hyperbolic equation. It's this thing here, this thing circled in red, which is this F, is really just a function of phi bar and the radius. So you essentially have something that looks like d phi bar dt plus d by dz of some nonlinear function of phi bar is 0. And that's a hyperbolic advection equation. Nonlinear advection equation. And so there's some nice techniques of tracking characteristics and such like that you can use to analyze this kind of problem. And it turns out that essentially qualitatively this whole thing was done by Lighthill in the 1950s. And if you haven't seen this paper, I really recommend it because it's an incredibly beautiful way of doing applied mathematics. There's essentially no real maths in this problem. It's all a big thought experiment. but it's incredibly detailed and kind of powerful because it basically uncovers everything you need to know. What we're doing is essentially the same as this, done with a lot less elegance, and yeah, it's very impressive. So what he's doing is saying, let's consider traffic flow problems, and it's an empirical fact that he takes as read here that if you plot the flux of traffic down a road as a function of the concentration of cars, which is basically exactly the plot I was just showing you for particles, you get things that look broadly like this. They go up and then they come down again, which is sort of qualitatively the same as what I was just showing you. And in fact, if you reduce the capacity of the road at some point, let's say you make the road have roadworks on it or only have one lane instead of two, this flux curve just drops. So you get these other curves for more constricted roads, if you like. And his idea is, well, suppose you have a road that's coming in with this flux curve, but it turns into a road with this lower flux curve somewhere down the line where there's, let's say, roadworks, and you've got this advection equation which is telling you what's going on. What happens? And you can draw pictures like this. Again, I'm not going to tell the details of this. This is a characteristics plot. So this is showing essentially as a function of time, which is this axis, and space, which is this axis. You imagine you've got here a main road, a bottleneck, and then a main road on the other side. The bottleneck is like the constricted bit. So this is space going this way, time going this way. These are lines conveying, they're actually lines of constant concentration of cars, but mathematically they're lines sort of propagating information in the system. And what you find is that you get shocks and all sorts of things, but if the bottleneck is big enough, you get that the information starts going backwards again. So you have cars driving along, but over time you suddenly get this turnaround and upstream propagation of information, which we all know on a road, right? If there is roadworks, cars start backing up, so information is going backwards again from the roadworks. And that's essentially what's going on here. Right, those ideas, I'm not actually going to talk about characteristics for my system, but those ideas are basically will be relevant here. So now, let's suppose we've got a constricted pipe. So imagine you've got a pipe that looks like this. This is the pipe radius, starts off at 1, becomes a half as you go along. This is down the stream. And let's suppose you've got this. These are actual flux curves from this model. And I'm showing here the flux curve for different radii associated with the change from this radius to this one. So the highest purple curve here is the flux curve for this bit of pipe, and the lowest flux curve is the flux curve for this constricted bit of pipe. So now you suppose you come along and say, I want to impose on this system a fixed incident solid fraction. So I've got some machine and I'm imposing a fixed total flux on this thing, and I'm going to say that my solid fraction should be whatever it should be at the inlet. So let's say it's this value. Then you simply read off from this at a steady state. You just read off, well, what that must be. That must correspond to this much flux. So then you can just go along this line and say, well, in a steady state, the flux must be conserved through any bit of pipe. So I can just read off what the solid fraction is by these green crosses as I go, as the radius changes. So those green crosses simply map out this profile here, which is a solid fraction profile. And in a steady state in this world, you pump it in at some value, 0.35, and in the constricted bit, it increases in order to conserve total flux. So that's fine. That kind of makes sense. The problem happens if you have this scenario. Suppose you pick a different solid fraction, this one here, and you say, fine, yeah, that tells me what the solid flux is coming in, so I just read off what it is until you reach this point, and then you say, well, hang on, but there is no flux. This purple line doesn't cross this red dashed one. So there is no flux in this constricted bit that will sustain there is no phi that will sustain the flux I'm trying to impose on the system in this problem. So there seems to be no steady solution. So then you can say, well, what happens? So now I'm going to show you some time-dependent simulations, which hopefully show you what happens. So these are two simulations for the same radial drop like this, and this. And there's some initial steady state for some low initial phi, 0.2. And now in this one, I'm raising the incident phi to 0.35, and on this one, I'm raising the incident phi to 0.45. And then we're going to see what happens. So you run them forward. Sorry, these videos are a bit slow. But the wave kind of comes in, and on the left, it just happily marches to the new steady state. On the right, you see it kind of backs up and develops a shock. This is a vertical line, which is now propagating back upstream. And it will keep propagating upstream until it collides with where we got to. And as it does that, let's see. You can also measure what the total resistance to this is. So in this problem, I'm fixing the total flow rate. The resistance is basically a measure of the total pressure drop I must be exerting to achieve that flow rate. And in this case, in these two examples, the left-hand one, it basically increases slightly to deal with this increase in solid fraction, but the right-hand one increases significantly, so the pressure gradient required to pump this down is enormous compared to the pressure gradient that we had before. So the resistance just grows and grows as this shock propagates backwards. To understand, now you see the right-hand one has attained a new steady state, but with a significantly higher phi than I was originally trying to impose on it. So it's gone to I tried to put in this phi, and it's actually developed a steady state with a completely different one. And you can see what's going on. On the right here, I'm just showing the flux curve for the least constricted and most constricted bit of the pipes, the purple and the purple. So the initial state in this system was at this low flux here, F0. I increased it by imposing my new phi, I increased to this new F here, and you can simply read off what the new steady state is going to be from those 2 points there, and that's what you get here. On this side, you do the same thing. You start here, you go up to this one here, you try and read it off, but you can't, as we've seen already. So what happens is instead, that the constricted bit lets through as much as it can, which is this point here. You can't manage the grey amount, it lets through the red amount, and it backs up the rest of the solid, so it builds up this kind of backup of solid, and what that does is push this one right round over here onto the high phi branch. Remember, there were two solutions with the same thing, so it pushes it all the way around here, and ultimately lowers the flux to this maximum that it can attain, and it pushes the upstream thing onto this high phi branch, not the low phi branch. So you get an upstream phi, which is this red dot here. You might think it would just drop to this point here, but it doesn't. Because it's backing up solid, it kind of causality, it has to push you around to this branch here. So that's what we would call clogged. Right, I'm conscious time is drifting on. That's sort of the main thing I would like to say. It's this kind of interesting upstream propagation. This is just showing you exactly how you create these states. So I think this box is just demonstrating exactly what I just told you. You can make plots like this, for example, where you say, okay, now so I can just construct the steady states now, given this, I know how this clogging works. If I imagine imposing an inlet solid fraction on a system and saying what will the eventual steady state be, if you look at the top, I'm plotting what I'm calling the emergent solid fraction that comes out the other end. So the solid fraction, you try and impose this solid fraction at the start, and you find eventually that it actually wants to be something different. If you're imposing a low enough value, then this thing just gives you back the value you put in. But at some point, you hit this clogging jump. These are different values of the constriction. So this one is the most constricted, it's reduced by the most amount. But whatever the constriction is, at some point you hit this constriction, and this will just jump up to somewhere very near, in this case the maximum solid fraction is 0.65. So it'll jump up to something very near there, and the associated resistance of the flow also jumps up dramatically at that point. And this is kind of my takeaway point. You get this emergent clogging, and you get upstream propagation of information at that point. You get exactly the same thing. If we go back to the original motivation for this, was not actually channels that just become thinner. It was sickle cell disease, where it's not the channel that changes, it's the properties of the suspension. Now it starts to become a bit woolly, because constitutive models for deformable suspensions are they're in their infancy, I would say. It's quite complicated. And so what's going on in red blood cells is they start off incredibly deformable. Red blood cells are incredibly deformable. And when they become sickled, they essentially become substantially more rigid. And a very bad way of parameterizing that is simply to say that there's some change in the jamming fraction, that it becomes somewhat lower when it becomes rigid. It's pretty ad hoc, but there is some evidence that is what happens, amongst other things. So you can imagine that you can do the same thing. Instead of having a pipe where the radius changes, you have a pipe with a fixed radius, and all you do is impose that along the pipe, the jamming fraction, so the phi m, the maximum phi, changes from some value down to some other value. Here, 0.8 dropping to 0.6 as you go along. So this would be like red blood cells becoming deoxygenated and becoming more rigid. And you get exactly the same phenomenon. If the drop is not very significant, then you evolve to a steady state that has a slight rise in phi like that. If the drop is more significant, then you can evolve to get this backwards propagating shock. This is moving forwards in time, and you get this jam state with a much higher solid fraction at the end, which propagates upstream. Right, the last thing I want to say is just to mention, this is some work that we have a postdoc now, Cara, who's sitting at UCL, who's working on using some of these ideas in network models, which people care about in all sorts of areas of particularly biology. And one thing she started thinking about is applying it to the eye. So retinal occlusions are actually a major problem in eye physics. And here's not a very clear picture, but this is a picture of the eye and the retina. And you can see sort of blood vessels going around, and there's this whole patch of kind of red stuff here. This is a characteristic feature of a retinal occlusion. So somewhere here there's a jam, and that's basically caused blood to sort of leak out in a way that's not good. And there's all sorts of different things to do with what kinds of retinal occlusion you can get. But that kind of motivates the idea that one might care about things like this. So this is not real eye data, but it's a sort of synthetic creation of the arterial network in an eye, in half an eye. So the idea here is it comes in here at the central artery and branches repeatedly into smaller and smaller things, and you can actually overlay this with a vein network coming back out again if you want to. So here you can imagine problems like saying, okay, well, this is just a series of pipes. I'm going to say there's a steady state in each pipe. This is kind of classic network modeling. You say there's pipes connected with pressures at each node, and I'm going to impose a pressure at the inlet and impose a sort of ambient pressure at all of the outlets and see what happens. And you can do that with our model effectively once you've understood this thing about clogging and not clogging, and in particular taking into account that if you get clogging, if you find yourself in this situation where a downstream vessel clogs, in other words, it's unable to sustain the flux you're trying to give it, that sends information back upstream. It propagates a shock back into the vessel that was feeding it with a high solid fraction. That's this upstream backup. It's like a traffic jam that we've just been seeing. That feature is kind of important once you're starting networks because you can get kind of non-linear interaction between clogging somewhere and what happens. So here, for example, Cara sent me this yesterday, so I haven't really sort of analysed this in any detail, but it's kind of interesting. You can do a thought experiment with this. You can say, let's suppose I pick a vessel, let's say this one here, and just in this case, she's going to make the radius much smaller, just as a way of effectively clogging it. So you just arbitrarily make the radius of that little bit of branch much smaller. And if you do that with like a Newtonian Poisson flow model, you get something like this. Here I'm showing the colours of the solid flux. So if you imagine just saying, oh, well, suspension is just a Newtonian fluid where there is some phi, which I associate with the total flux. This is what you get. You basically say, well, I clogged that one, so everything downstream of that gets hardly any flux going into it. If you do it with our model that I just was talking about, you get this instead. So I'm going to try and show you, there's a Newtonian picture in between, but if I go back to the original picture here, this is the fluxes, they go from high to low here just purely because of the branching, right? So you're sending in lots and it branches, so inevitably it gets smaller. So that's why it goes from red to green. If I go forward to this one, you see that there's, okay, this inevitably, of course, all the downstream from the clog goes clogged up, but you actually get significant effects. These are our log scales. This is really quite significant effects all over the place. Even like right out here on the other branch gets affected. And it's all because of what's going on here is that this one is clogging, that forces this branch into it to adopt a high phi, and that then has some impact on what can go down this one, which has all sorts of feedbacks. So you can ask, what I haven't got the data here, but you can look at what the solid fraction is actually doing in all these things, and it's changing significantly in all these pipes. Of course, there are all sorts of ways in which this model is an idealization, particularly of blood, so I want to be careful about applying this, but it makes the point that the kind of impact of this can be significant and non-local in a way that's quite interesting. Okay, I am going to stop there. So my summary, I guess, is there's lots of interesting things to do with clogging of suspensions. I mean, more generally, I think trying to use continuum models of suspensions which have problems, but there are things you can say, is quite an interesting problem. There's lots of rich applied maths and physics to learn from these sorts of systems. So I started off talking about purely yield stress fluids, which are, I think, kind of interesting enough, but it becomes a lot more interesting once you start coupling in some of the physics of suspensions to these things, and I ended with this clogging phenomenon. I'll just show those moves again. Thank you very much.